No niin, moi. Me ollaan täällä Scandza Kööpenhaminassa. Tässä tämä konferenssi alkaa tuossa ihan kohta. Täällä on tämä Fróði Midjord, joka on järjestämässä tätä. Ja niin kohta alkaa. Tosi upea päivä. Kuuluuko tämä hyvin? Kaveri toi tämmösen, niin periaatteessa mä voin kytkeä tänne. Laittaa sen tonne puhujan eteen, mutta mä en vielä tiedä, että miten tää homma menee. So this is the Scandza Forum live from Copenhagen. We will be starting soon. The speakers are listed in the description box. Puhujat löytyy tuolta videon infoboxista. Mä kokeilen, että miltä näyttää, jos mä menen tähän puhujan pönttöön. Tässä kello on nyt 1:02 ja tämän piti alkaa puolelta, mutta tässä on vähän hässäkkää. Täällä on sali aika täynnä. 5. No, täällä on, en mä osaa laskea. Niin tuossa tuo lähetin on USB-verkkovirrassa. Tää itse mikrofoni ei oo, mutta mä saan senkin. Jos kysytään, että saako täällä kuvata naamoja, niin näissä on yleensä ollut se periaate, että yleisöä ei kuvata. Tietysti jokainen halukas voi tulla aina meidän skriimiin. Meillä on tuo avoin mikki, kansan mikki niin sanotusti. Mä en tiedä, muistaakseni tää kestää, tai tuossa ei nyt hirveä määrä puhujia ole, mutta silti toi on ilmeisesti 7 asti, eli 8 aikaa Suomen aikaa. Kysytään, mitä Scandza tarkoittaa. No, Scandza Forum on tämmöinen pohjoismainen tämmöinen ajatushautomo. Ja tosiaan ollaan tässä tanskalaisessa 4G:ssä Saunalahden liittymällä. Rajaton pohjoismainen datapaketti. Tässä paikassa on varmaan VLAN, mutta en mä jaksa niittenkaan temppuilla. Siellä laittakaa linkkiä jakoon. Yläpeukuilla on vissiin totaalinen ilmaherruus, niin kuin aina. Sitten 3 alapeukkua. 3 katsojaa vihaa tanskalaisia. Mä en tiedä, toi on varmaan yksi järjestäjistä. Tanska on hieno paikka. Paljon mukavampi kuin Ruotsi. Täällä jotenkin ne on saanut, täällä ei ole, täällä on tietysti paljon maahanmuuttajia, mutta ne on jotenkin rauhallisempia kuin Ruotsissa. Tietysti ei olla vielä käyty pahimmilla alueilla. Täällä konferenssissa taitaa olla yhteensä ainakin 4 suomalaista. Et meillä on aika hyvä edustus. Tosiaan linkkiä saa jakaa. Joo, Markku on näköjään jakanut tänne. Kiitos jaoista, se auttaa tässä näkyvyyden saamisessa. Jaa, tää ei vielä alkanutkaan. Okei, nyt tuossa avattiin ovi.
Jared oli näköjään paikalla. Eli että Jared Taylor oli näköjään saapunut.
Okei. Ja hän on yksi niistä, tai varmaan pääpuhuja täällä. Mä vetää viimeisenä tämän. Me käytiin eilen jututtamassa sitä, oli ihan hauskaa.
Mä otin tuon hotellin vai paikkaan.
Okay, can I have your attention? Is there anyone who is from Copenhagen who knows this place a bit better than me, perhaps? Hands up. No one? Because I think there are maybe people still at the rendezvous point. Could you help someone go get them to see if someone, so they're not left outside? Okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry about that. It's just
No
that
problem.
people are.
Yeah,
We don't want to leave them outside.
Yeah. We have batteries, so
We'll not be very late.
Yeah, that's no problem at all.
Did you get a chance to talk to Jared last night?
But unfortunately we were a bit late, so we only had to keep it like a half an hour live stream with him. But it was nice to see him again.
Yeah. He's.
I saw that he has arrived.
Yeah. I think he was a bit jet lagged. So.
Yeah.
But you're coming to dinner afterwards?
Yeah.
Okay then.
Joo, kuulemma mikrofoni toimii hyvin. Tää on, mähän sanoin, että mä hommaan, niin kuin että mä hoidan hommat. Mä en tiedä, miten mulla olisi tämmönen jalusta tälle mikrofonille, mutta mä en tiedä, minne sen laittaisi. Tosiaan tässä osa ihmisistä on tuolla kokoontumispaikalla ja me odotetaan nyt niitä siis. Mä käyn katsoa, että löytyisikö tuolla jostain kahvia, että se olisi aika mukavaa. Mä kokeilen muuten yhtä juttua tässä.
The sound when I'm moving around. I'll just go over there and use this one for the remote control of this one.
Well, I'll probably be sitting there, and I will be holding this microphone. But
you'll pick the sound.
Yeah, it should. This is it's quite powerful.
Yeah.
So
okay, that's fine.
And we have live comments. So people can tell if they don't hear you. So I will try to come closer. Yeah. What microphone will you be using? The one there, or?
I don't know. I'll be walking around.
Yeah.
Do we have a mobile microphone?
My friend might have one. I'll see if I can give you the microphone here.
So, thank you.
Ja tosiaan tässä, mä en tiedä minne tuo kaveri lähti, silloin oli noita langattomia enemmänkin. Mulla tosiaan tämä näin tässä, tää mikrofoni, niin tuohon saa myös semmoisen pienemmän, mutta sitten mä joudun antaa tämän laitteen noille, niin se on siinä mielessä vähän hankala. Mut katsotaan, jos mä saan tän tähän näin. Joo, ei tää oikein toimi. Tuo yksi sanoi, että se on aikoo liikkua täällä. Niin mä mulla on myös tämmönen niin tän sais tähän samaan mötikkään. Ja sitten voisi antaa tämän sille puhujalle. Mutta katsotaan, jos tuossa kaverilla olisi toinen systeemi. Saadaan vielä laadukkaammat äänet noille puhujille. Toisaalta tietysti kun nuo puhuu tuonne, niin mistähän tässä on varmaan joku laite, että jonne voisi kytkeä tämän. Ja sit saisi suoraan äänet tuolta. Joo, mä jätän Tiinalle tämän mikrofonin, mä käyn kattoo kahvia, jos löytyy.
Okei. Melko on kaikki muut kanavat on bändissä. Oli pakko tehdä yksi varakanavasta sitä tapahtumaa varten, ettei käy niin, että romahtaa bändit keskittymään reissuun ja sitten mitään kanavaa millä striimata.
Joo, täällä sanottu Full HD Natsi-meeting. Sehän täsmälleen on erittäin salainen Natsi-meeting. Mitä? Muitakin suomalaisia? Juu, onhan täällä. Joo, ilmeisesti tässä on vähän niin, että tämä saattaa ottaa ehkä jopa liian kaukaa pikkusen nuo äänet, niin pitää ehkä Juneksen kanssa vähän tuolta miettiä, kun se tulee takaisin tuolta. Biffillä äärimmäinen someraivo uudesta mikistä. Kyse onko Junes ainut rodullistettu täällä? Kyllä se muuten varmaan on. Olettaisin, että se on. En ole katsonut kaikkia vieraita läpi. Ja 6 piffiläistä on kyllä herännyt. Kysellä onko Screamia tulossa joltain huonomaineiselta alueelta reissun aikana, niin en mä tiedä, vaan kyllä sitä varmaan se olisi ihan kiinnostava käydä siellä jossain Nörrebrussa. Pidetään matukierrosta. Joo, katsotaan tuossa, mitä keksitään. Juu, tuolla kyse, että ei kai se haittaa mitään, jos mikki ottaa äänet kaukaakin. No ei se yleisesti ottaen niin hirveästi haittaa, mutta sillä kun ollaan tämmöisessä tapahtumassa, missä saattaa taustalla ihmiset puhua myöskin semmoisia asioita, mitä ne ei tarkoita minnekään streamille, niin silloin se saattaa olla vähän ongelma. Joo, se Junes on näköjään nyt tulossa takaisin. Onko hämärän näköistä pressiväkeä piiloutunut? No ei ainakaan Jeni parkkaria pongattu vielä täältä. Täällä Tom Evola sanoo, että arvosana Little Valkkari. Niin joo, mä testasin sitä toista niistä, sitä mitä se nyt olikaan. Ja se oli jotakin hyvin kuivaa valkoviiniä ja se oikeasti oli erittäin kuivaa. Se oli niinku semmoista aika erikoista. En mä sano, että se erityisen paha oli, mutta siis todella kuivaa. Jos joku Käninen tulee heilaamaan niin N-sana viljelemään, niin se on Hesarin toimittaja. No niin voisi olla, että ei tämä oikein ole sitä porukkaa. Täällä vissiin nyt alkaa olla löytynyt ne kadonneet vieraat, kun porukan määrä on kasvanut lisää. Niin ja alkaa olla sali täynnä, niin tässä varmaan kohta aloitellaan. Ja kyse, että miten lentomatka meni. Hyvinhän se. Ja se oli vielä reilusti etuajassa se lentosti perille.
All right, folks, please have a seat. We're going to start.
Close the door?
Yes.
Because it's getting rather cool.
Okay. I'm sorry about the delay. We are still missing a few people, and I was just worried that they were still at the rendezvous point, so I just didn't want them to be left outside. That's why we have waited a few more extra minutes. Remember that this is a private event, so please don't take any pictures, make any kind of recordings. We do have photographers, and this is going to be live streamed, but they have special instructions, so please don't do that. If you're going to write something about this, just let me know if you need pictures. We'll arrange that afterwards. So please make sure that your mobile phones are turned off so we don't disturb the speakers. I'll just wait a few seconds while you make sure that is done. All right, welcome to the Scandza Forum. This is our first time in Denmark, which completes a milestone of our mission to be active in all the 3 Scandinavian countries. Scandza, I got a question earlier about what Scandza, where the word comes from. It's the oldest known name for Scandinavia. It's written by Jordanus, a Byzantine historian who was writing in the 500s, in the 6th century, and he talked about the island Scandza in the north, which is Scandinavia. So it's the oldest name we have for our holy land. Something about the schedule for today. We're going to start with the speeches. The speeches are going to be a bit short. They're going to be 20 minutes each, the individual speeches. And we'll not have time for any questions during the speeches. So if you have any questions, write them down, because there's going to be a Q&A session afterwards. We're going to collect all the speakers on stage, and we're going to take all the questions then. So the speeches, we're going to run through all the speeches, just have a short break in between, and then around 3 o'clock, 3:30, we're going to have a break where you can go get some lunch, and then we're going to open a bar with refreshments, and then we're going to get together again for a Q&A, a panel discussion, for about an hour and a half. And then we're going to just socialize the last hour. So we're going to vacate the venue around 7:30, 8. The reason for gathering like this, it's something I never get tired of mentioning. It's that people are not only rational. Human beings are not only rational creatures, they are first and foremost social creatures. And if the politically correct society disagrees with us, it's not like they're gonna tell us that we think you're wrong and here's why. What they try to do is they try to isolate you socially. So they try to get you cast out of society, out of polite society, put social pressure on you. So in order to silence you, basically. So that's why it's very important to not just have an online movement or just present facts. We actually have to network in real life and get together like this. A couple of weeks ago, John Morgan invited me to the Countercurrents radio for an interview, and he asked me what the purpose of the Scandza Forum is. And I have basically three main purposes for the Scandza Forum. I'm going to talk about one of them today. And that is the reason why the generic left, so to speak, has been winning for about, well, 100 years at least, not more. If we just sort of ignore some of the deterministic historical theories like that we are in a downward slope in a sort of Spenglerian civilizational cycle, and that we are in a mouse utopia that sort of creates weakness, that creates what the Japanese call herbivore men, that sort of have lost their libido and lost their will to power and lost their will to fight. There's one main reason why the left is winning, and what I call conservatives have been losing all the time, consistently, with just minor sort of disruptions from conservatives in this leftward progress, if you like that term. That one reason is that the left has strategy instead of just tactics. I'm not going to be a Clausewitz or anything and talk. So bear with me if you disagree with my definitions of strategy and tactics. But what I mean is that a tactical focus is on a limited perspective, on a political confrontation here and now, whereas strategy is the big picture. It's how different tactical situations are connected together. So strategy is an understanding of your political goals in the long term, an understanding of your opponents' or enemies' political goals in the long term, and an understanding of how political power works in a modern society. And what has happened is that the left has had strategy, whereas conservatives, or the right, if you like, have been focused on the very small, limited perspective. And you see, it doesn't really matter if you just win small confrontations if you don't understand where your enemy wants to go, or where you want to go. So the left always has the initiative, and the right always just reacts, because it has no visions of its own. So the left is very correct in labeling rightists, to a great extent, reactionaries, because they're only fighting a reactive battle. Oftentimes, hopefully not we, but generally speaking. So, and by the left, I just mean an unorganic view of society. I don't mean people who call themselves left. I mean in very sort of general and generic terms. And conservatives or reactionaries are the people who, at best, will try to counter a very limited move, but often doesn't really have a vision of where it wants to go itself. and they focus only on the latest move of the left. So often what the left was a moment ago is what the conservatives are now. I'm flogging a dead horse, I know, because this is something that has been stated many, many times over. But I think it's important for us to know how that works and why it works like that. So I can give you a few examples of what I mean. This very limited perspective tends to focus very much on party politics, so that people invest too high hopes in the latest sort of political savior or a political party. People invest a lot of hope in Ron Paul or Donald Trump or Putin or the Sweden Democrats or whatever, and they confuse the means and ends. So they get very much invested in the limited perspective of this specific tool. That limited perspective is also true, of course, of people who are completely opposed to party politics. People who think that a political candidate is never good enough, like people who are overly critical of Donald Trump because he isn't our guy completely. So we have to be able to see the utility of a specific political movement or a person or a party and still keep our cool and not be completely dejected when we don't get enough votes or whatever. It's just a tool and we have to see it like that. For example, people were very critical of Donald Trump because he has a Jewish son-in-law and he's very much invested in sort of the Jewish power structure, and he isn't really our guy, and so on and so forth. But he has definitely helped raise our questions and our perspective and bring them into the mainstream debate. There is a definite difference after and before Donald Trump, just as it is before and after the Sweden Democrats came into the parliament in Sweden in 2010. There was a distinct difference in the way people felt permission to criticize mass immigration after the Sweden Democrats came into parliament, and that's unmistakable. Another example of this very limited perspective is of course, too much focus on Islam and Muslims. The counter-jihad movement, to just use a term for it, people like Tommy Robinson, or he's a very famous example of that. And of course it's unpleasant to see large groups of Muslims and Arabs in cities like Copenhagen or Paris or London or Stockholm, but it's only an effect, it's not a cause. It's not the cause of the problem. It's a symptom of a cultural disease. And just focusing on the Muslims or whatever is like using only painkillers to fix a broken leg. The problem is still there. You just sort of numb the very superficial symptoms of it. And the fact is that it isn't the Muslims that have lobbied for opening the floodgates of immigration to Europe or America for that matter. And they are not the ones who have been the Trojan horse in our society. And it is not Muslims who have produced thousands and thousands of movies where white people are portrayed as villains and that poison our minds with white guilt. And it's also not Muslims that are running watchdog organizations, monitoring every attempt of white people to assert their own interests and countering that. In fact, when it comes to breaking down our cultural immune system and when it comes to creating widespread ethnomasochism in European countries, Muslims have had basically zero political agency. What I mean by agency is just the ability to willfully create or cause political change through your actions. So the Muslims have just been pawns in that game. They have not been the player behind. They have not been the political or cultural agents behind that change. Another example, with the risk of being a bit tedious with many examples, is assimilation and integration. I will not make a difference. I know people use it, make a difference between assimilation and integration, just making them a part of our society. We had a discussion at dinner last night, whether it was desirable or not to have, this was about the burqa bans. I'm just going to get a glass of water. This was about the burqa bans in Denmark. So, is it desirable to ban Muslims from wearing a burqa? Is it desirable to make them a part of society? To make them sort of behave normal? I say no. We had a slight disagreement about this, and that's fine. You're free to disagree with me, but it's sort of like, if you have a child, if you have a son that you love, would you have that son replaced by a boy from around the globe you don't know just because he can behave as a normal person? I don't think so. I'm invested in our bloodline, so I don't care. I would to make the point, I would rather see even non-Muslims wear burqas, so we could sort of make that distinction even clearer. I don't want them assimilated at all. To make the point shortly, I just mean that if we want to win this cultural struggle, if we do not want to do this only for our own entertainment, and I think it is and could and should be fun and entertaining as it is, we have to have a strategical purpose. We have to understand the goals, the political goals of our opponents, our enemies. We have to have political long-term goals of our own. We cannot only react to the latest fad of the quote-unquote left. And we have to understand how politics, how political power works in a modern society. And that's one of the main purposes of the Scandza Forum. And I think that's, well, one of the things we're doing is this, and I think we can contribute to that long-term, big picture understanding of how this works. But to just show that we're not neurotic about this, we're going to start with a sort of smaller term perspective with party politics, namely the Swedish election. Which brings us to our first speaker. And he has been a budget director for the Sweden Democrats. He got out of the Sweden Democrats and works metapolitically now with the Nordic Alt-Right and podcasts and holds his own conferences successfully. And he's going to give us his perspective on the Swedish election last week. So please welcome Christoffer Dulny.
Thank you very much. Do you mind taking your computer so I can put my iPad here? Thanks very much for inviting me, Fróði. You don't know what you're unleashing here on this stage. You absolute madman. I want to say hello to Denmark. I want to say hello to Norway, Sweden, Latvia, Finland, and everyone who's watching. Hello, and I'm very excited to be here on the stage. I have a podcast host, his name is Gustav, and he said that the general political elections is like the Eurovision Song Contest, but without the music, so what's the point? And there's a kernel of truth there. So I live in a small suburb outside Stockholm, Sweden. Sweden, yes, the Sweden. The one and only, the social engineers of our time, the canary in the coal mine. I do have to admit that in my neighborhood, the cars don't burn. Feral immigrants don't roam the streets. And I haven't seen Captain Sweden yet. Soon. To be honest, I think I encounter these experiences in Sweden as much as you do. Which is to say, not at all. Now, why is that? Well, it's because we live in a deeply segregated society, bordering on parallel worlds. I remember reading a post on a popular Swedish message board. It's called Flashback, where people were shocked that a man decided to travel 10 minutes from the city center in Stockholm to visit an immigrant-heavy neighborhood to score some drugs or whatever. But to travel halfway across the world to go to some exciting ethnic festival or food festival, that seems to people to be completely normal. We are indeed living in very interesting times. And there's something to be said about the horror show that Sweden is made out to be. It is not living hell, and there are grief mongers and black pillars who are trying to profit from this view and image of Sweden, and they are not making our jobs any easier. Most of the shootings, most of the car burnings, the lootings, the rape, etc., just the sheer amount of violence is safely secluded to suburbs outside the city centers. So normal Swede doesn't have to experience it. Very well planned. The normal Swede is probably living in a Soma-like existence. Maybe he's living in the city center, maybe he's living in the suburb, whatever, but he doesn't experience it. He doesn't experience the fact that larger swaths of Swedish territory is being given away or even financed by the Swedes to foreigners who are hostile against us. So we have indeed fallen from grace, and this socialist utopia with its ethnically homogeneous country, I think it was perhaps best described by our former Prime Minister, Tage Erlander, who in the 1960s said, and I'm quoting, "We Swedes live in such an infinitely happier situation. Our country's population is homogeneous, not only in terms of race, but also in many other respects." He was commenting the race riots in America. And one wonders, what kind of words would he have for us today? Clearly, his world doesn't exist any longer. It's gone. On the other hand, the very recent general elections that were held on September 9th tells us that the Swede doesn't really feel that Sweden is turning into Mad Max anytime soon. Even if me, myself, I personally sometimes wish for it. Would be quite cool. So the results from the elections came in. And the big surprise was that nothing really changed that much. Now, I won't go into detail about which team scored the highest, but let's just say that the Sweden Democrats are still just the third biggest party. Just like before. And the other blocs, Team Red, Team Blue, whatever, about equal in size. The Sweden Democrats have strengthened their position as a kingmaker, but the other blocs still refuse to acknowledge the ugly duckling. So we're in a situation where nobody really knows what's going to happen. We had a new challenger, Alternative for Sweden. They ran a very provocative and high-energy campaign, but failed to excite the electorate very much. They got 0.3%. And they used to use the OK sign. You all know this sign, right? The OK sign. Well, it has a different meaning now, 0.3%. But I'm not worried about them. I know they're high-energy guys. They are going to go into a new election cycle, 2019, the European elections. Let's see what happens. It's said that right-wing winds are blowing all over the world, all over the global north at least, even in Brazil, you see. And this is true. There is a seismic shift in what people are talking about. How they relate to mass immigration from the global south, and also in a way how they are relating to their own identity. And I think we all here are in a thankful position of not having to ask the question, but rather supply the answers. Who are you? A man of European ancestry. Who are we? The greatest civilization there ever were. In the realpolitik, The hot topics of the day are immigration, crime, and what future we as Europeans will have in this diverse, new, exciting society of ours. Demographics are destiny, and it's manifesting before our very own eyes in this very moment. So with this said, how come the Swedes voted up towards 80% for one of the establishment parties? Well, I think one question we have to ask ourselves is, are they even voters or are they clients of the welfare state? Some voters just feel that the bureaucrat gangs are people with a bit more charisma, catering to whatever special interest that these groups wants to be served this week, this month. And I have to say, yeah, I totally agree with that. That's true. And I think this is especially true for the immigrants who are now block voting for leftist candidate in exchange for gifts, promises of a new mosque, a position in a party that they sold their vote to. We're now seeing figures of 80 to 90% in all of these troubled areas. And they vote for the leftists. And this is the mean. There's even higher numbers. So I think this year's election will finally bring the topic of the minority bloc vote up for discussion. We're already seeing this taking place. Even the cucks, the moderates, are now questioning the mass migration that the Social Democrats engineered in order to import the votes. And this reminds me of the political election in America in 2012, when this also became an issue. Demonization of everything related to identity for Swedes, Europeans, and whites on a whole have and continue to be one of the most important factors in scaring people who have some semblance of understanding for a need for shared identity. You have also another segment of Swedes who are holding their noses while voting for one of the bad parties. And I think they view this act as a sort of an act of defiance. It's not really an act of taking their own side or having group interest. I think in their hearts, in their minds, they just want to go back to 2007 or whatever year it was before the impossibility that is liberal progressivism started to collapse on itself. And I have to say, I do understand them in a way, who want it to be known that they are supporting a political party that has been so thoroughly vilified by every known entity in your nation. Every NGO, from Greenpeace to your local knitting association, every company that wants to sell products or services, doesn't matter if it's a small coffee shop or it's IKEA, who have fully embraced diversity. Every official government outlet is out to get you. They have already implemented something we in Sweden call värdegrunden, which maybe would be best translated as the official code of conduct. And I don't think I need to mention the media. I will just point out that there's a very good reason that Sweden probably has one of the strongest alternative media presence, I would say, in the Western world. And it has been a decisive factor to get the Sweden Democrats where they are today. I think I'm not saying anything you maybe didn't already know. We all know the immense pressure to vote right. And it's on levels that shouldn't be possible. And another interesting, exotic thing about Swedish elections is that somehow they thought it would be a good idea to leave the voting ballots out in the open. So when you do go to cast your vote, you first have to pick a ballot so that everyone can see what a big racist you are for voting the wrong way. This will finally change after, I don't know how long the system has been in place, but let's say 100 years or so. So that's how much we value the secrecy of the vote in Sweden. Surely feeling the frustration of the system, the group leader and the big brain thinker in the Sweden Democrats, and he's sort of my nemesis, but that's another story. His name is Mattias Karlsson. He likes to post on Facebook. usually late after a few drinks. And he wrote an emotionally charged plea on his Facebook page after the election, where he correctly identified that this is a struggle for our very own existence, and that there's only two choices: victory or death. Now, you could argue that this might not have been the best strategy, considering that the Sweden Democrats are trying rather desperately to negotiate with the blue bloc, the blue team, the moderates. And this kind of rhetoric scares Swedes, because Swedes are handicapped by, I think, one of the longest pieces in modern time. And they are very afraid of people talking about destiny, about valor, about having an uncompromising stance on survival. But I digress. I think I'm not a theoretician. I'm not going to speculate on which bloc eventually gets to rule, because I don't think it matters so much at this point. I will, however, say I do think that the left has been terribly afraid. By all metrics, what happened in Sweden would have been considered a big win for nationalists just a few years ago. We are not happy, we're not satisfied with a few increases of percent in a political party. We want more. Let's look at the other teams. Let's look at the Social Democrats. They have done their worst election in over 100 years. Basically all of their existence. The Green Party is almost wiped out. And the focus in this election has been on the realpolitik topics that we like to talk about. Migration, crime, long-term solutions to these problems. And they are actually considered to be problems and not challenges that need to be overcome. 1 million Swedes did go to the voting booth to cast their ballots for the Sweden Democrats, a party that didn't exist in the parliament 8 years ago. Think about that. The real game changer, however, is what happened outside the parliament, outside the elections. We all know where opinions are formed, disseminated, propagated, and ultimately decided. The charade that takes place in the parliament is just the final stamp of approval. And we, the normal people, the people of the real right, we are allowed to have our say, despite our difficulties. And people are listening to us. And frankly, I hate to say this, but failure to have a meaningful change via the ballot will make us more relevant for people who have the will and the understanding of what's going on. I think it's true that we have been a bit greedy. I don't think greed is good. Greed is never good. We have been greedy. I take full responsibility for being greedy. I went to Charlottesville. I learned my lesson. I think we were all high on our own supply, which I think it's good to be a little bit high in your own supply, but not too much. I think the election of Trump, which was this just political volcano, I think it made us think that we were ready to go public, that we were ready to penetrate the mainstream and maybe even become some sort of mainstream actor. We need to rethink the situation a bit. And Trump still hasn't built that damn wall, so that maybe shows you what elections are about, really. As men of ideas, we ultimately should not care if the red or the blue team wins. As long as the team carries our ideas to the forefront, shifting the Overton window and making the unacceptable acceptable again, and thus enabling us to discuss the true questions of our time: race, spirituality, and the real meaning of a nation. It's people. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was a great speech, and I agree completely. Our purpose is outside of the parliament. We sort of like the left has been doing for so long that is this working? Yes, it is. Okay. They have controlled what all the parties are doing. They have influenced all the complete every section of the political spectrum. That's what we are going to do as well. Let's just take a short break and just 5 minutes. Can the person who there was some mistake with the name on the guest list? Can that person just talk to me in the break, and then we'll meet here in just 5 minutes again for the next talk.
Tässä on pieni tauko nyt, 5 minuuttia. Tässä ja tuo parakas tyyppi on Fróði, se oli meillä Helsingissä huhtikuussa. Ja ja sitten tuo toinen oli se varsinainen ensimmäinen puhuja. Se on nyt pieni ongelma näiden USB-johtajien kanssa, kun tuo mikrofoni tässä jotenkin, mutta eiköhän tämä onnistu tämä. En muista mikä Christoffer Dulny tai joku tämmönen, että se on entinen ilmeisesti SD-poliitikko ja tuossa se nyt kertoi näkemyksensä tämänhetkisestä tilanteesta. Ja tulossa lisää puhujia. Tässä on nyt lyhyt muutaman minuutin tauko. Jos tämän näissä USB-johtajien päissä on jotain eroja, että kaikki ei sovi. Nyt se varmaan sähkö toimii. Tässä mikrofonissa alkoi tuo valo vilkkumaan, niin mä ajattelin, että se tarkoittaa paristoa, niin mä kytkin sen USBiin. Yeah, so hello, so what? Still in Copenhagen and tuossa joku suvakki vinkuu, että kun on tylsää, kun ei voi kuvata ihmisiä, mutta se on teidän vikaa. Että jos te ette polttaisi autoja, niin ette antaisi potkuja ihmisille niiden mielipiteistä, niin ei täällä kenenkään tarvitse piilotella. Että ihmiset ei halua julkisuuteen, koska te olette järjestänyt tämän systeemin. Yes, so what Taylor will be one of the speakers here today. And so there's the list of speakers available in the description box.
Man bliver ret. Der var nok... man kan godt blive bange for det video, og lavet så
Okei, täällä on joku VLAN, mutta se vaatii jotain kirjautumistietoa. Mulla ei ole niitä. So, are you the next speaker?
Yes.
Yeah. What's your name?
Matthew Tait.
Yeah, you are from the BNP, ex-BNP.
Yeah, many years ago. Yes.
Yeah, because we are doing a YouTube live here, and the speakers are in the description box. But yeah, it's
Okay, you're doing a live stream. Okay,
Yeah.
right. Fantastic.
yeah. People are complaining because we cannot film the audience, and I said, well, it's you have created the situation in which people are afraid to show their faces, and it's a pity that it's that
Yeah, it's unfortunate that you can't see the audience because they're very beautiful, attractive, strong-looking men, beautiful women. So unfortunately, you should have attended so that you could see the audience for yourself.
Yeah, that's right. And the room is full also. Tää on tosiaan, sali on täys ja tilaisuus upea. Niin, tämä seuraava puhuja on siis Matthew Tait, joka on entinen BNP-työntekijä. Mä en tiedä tarkemmin, että mitä hän siellä tekee, mutta eiköhän hän kerro tässä kohta. Tässä on joku suvakki VLAN, kun tää vaatii kirjautumistietoja, niin mä en pysty läppäriltä seuraamaan kommentteja. Jared Taylor on varmaan viimeinen puhuja. Okei, tää valmistelee kalvoja tässä, niin tosiaan peukuttakaa ja laittakaa linkkiä jakoon vähän joka paikkaa. Tässä jossain vaiheessa on ilmeisesti ruokailu. Se kai kuuluu tähän lipun hintaan. Ja no, tää on tuossa kommenteissa someraivoo siitä, että näitä tyrmääviä blondeja täällä ei saa kuvata. No, olisitte tullut tätä tuossa alussahan muistutti taas siitä, että miksi näitä konferensseja järjestetään, niin on se, että nämä on mukavia tämmöisiä verkostoitumistapahtumia. Että tietysti netissä öyhöttäminen on hauskaa, mutta myös hauskaa on tavata sitten ihmisiä. Ja sillä on aika iso vaikutus, että ja nämä on, en mä tiedä, nämä on hyviä puheita. Nämä on mielenkiintoisia juttuja. Että en tiedä. Joku Oula Silvennoisen sössötys, niin sitä, tai noita Stubbin ja Tuppuraisen juttuja, niin niillä on 5 katsojaa. Joo, olen tietoinen, että Tampereella on natsismin vastaiset jutut. Ja joku suvakki kysyy, että miksen voisi seurata läppäriltä, että mulla on puhelimessa nettijako. Joo, mutta kun mä tällä puhelimella skriimaan, niin mä haluan, että se koko kaista on tämän skriimin käytössä. En mä tarvitse. Tässä on Yeah, it will. I think it's okay from here because anyways your voice will be coming from through the speakers. Okay. The audience said that they can hear everybody. So do you want to tell us your name?
Helmuth Nyborg.
There was during one of the speeches there was one guy asking when has Helmuth Nyborg already spoken, because he might be the most interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So do you know?
Am I next now or?
I don't know. I don't know.
You might have to ask Fróði.
We'll find out.
Okei, tää oli siis Helmuth Nyborg.
Mä mäkin just miettiä, onko tää Helmuth Nyborg, mutta mä enkin halunnut kysyä. Niin.
Joo. Ja tosiaan kommenteissa, mä muistan, oliko se N-Jake75, joka sanoi, että onko Helmut jo puhunut, koska hän vaikuttaa mielenkiintoisimmalta. Niin tosiaan yläpeukku ja hit that like button ja share the link so we can get more views. Sitten tää Suvakki kysyi, että eikö Tiinalla ole nettiä. No, me ostettiin yksi datapaketti ulkomaille, niin ei me ostettu kahta. 88 yläpeukkua. Olisiko sinne vielä 14 alapeukkua? Tässä taitaa kaikki puhujat olla miehiä. Yleisössä on naisia, mutta puhujissa ainoastaan vaan miehiä, kai, jos mä oon oikein ymmärtänyt. Ja siellä puhujalista. Tämä seuraava on tämä brittimies.
Okay, folks, please have a seat. It's time to start again. Right.
Joo, tuossa oli puhetta AFS:n tuloksista, niin niillä on jotain 0,3. Vähän uudelleenlaskenta käynnissä.
All right, let's start.
Mäkin tuossa juttelin sen Siin kanssa.
Martin, kan du stänga dörren så vi kan börja? Right. I'm going to keep these introductions a bit short because we're behind schedule. Waited for some people who didn't show up. I hope they didn't get lost anywhere or didn't get the message with the actual venue earlier today. The next speaker is a good friend of mine. He has been active in politics for more than 15 years. He was a BNP party official for a long time. He has spoken at 2 AmRen conferences. He has appeared on Red Eyes several times. He spoke at one conference in Stockholm that I organized together with Logik Förlag in 2015. I very much appreciate his speech. Please welcome Tait.
Thank you for the introduction, Fróði, and it's a pleasure to come and contribute to another conference that you have excellently organised. So, also thank you all for coming. It's an amazing turnout, so it's great to see so many people at a conference like this. And this is my first time in Denmark, so it's also good from a travel perspective. Okay, so I should first of all say that what I'm talking about today is a topic on which I'm not professionally qualified it's just something that is of great interest of mine, and it's something that I've read a lot about. So I want to make a disclaimer that I'm not a doctor or a nutritional expert. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is, from an evolutionary point of view, how we've been told, in the same way that we're told things that are wrong politically, we've been told things that are wrong nutritionally and in terms of lifestyles that we treat as normal. So I would encourage you to do your own research, and if you have any kind of a health issue, to be very careful with any changes that you make based on what I might say. Now, I think everyone in this room will be wise enough to know that liberals seem to like to tell us how to see the world. They tell us that everyone is equal, that men and women are the same, or that these notions of difference don't exist. The same thing goes for ethnicity or race. They say that these things are unimportant, or races just don't exist. It's just a social invention. Now, we know better than that because we have an understanding of our own biology. So we're willing to look at scientific information related to how we evolved. And I think that that understanding of our evolution gives us a better grounding with which to look at the topic of my talk today. The very same institutions who tell us that equality is the greatest moral good, that sexes don't exist, different races don't exist, and who try to encourage us to dissolve our nation states and all the things that we know about all too well. These are the same globalist institutions who are telling us what is healthy and what is unhealthy. And I'm particularly talking about what it is that we are supposed to eat. You've probably heard newspaper headlines, and there is a generally accepted notion, for example, that saturated fat causes heart attacks and clogged arteries, for example. You may also have heard that vegetable oils are more healthy choices, maybe margarine, for example. That red meat is bad for you in some way. You should choose leaner meats like chicken or fish. And if you have chicken, you should take the skin off before you eat it. You may also have heard these familiar moral arguments that liberals like about how animal farming is immoral. Now, there are two sides to the issue of is animal farming immoral. One is about animal rights, and that one I think probably everyone here would agree that they've seen things about animal farming which would turn their stomach, that they don't want to see animals raised in this way. And I think we could probably all agree that animals should be treated with respect. The other side of that is a bit more complicated, and that is that animal farming is in some way immoral because it is bad for the planet. And of course the green movement has become very, very powerful over the years and is probably at an all-time high of their power. And a lot of people will say that animal farming is immoral because the amount of land that you have to use, or because of the amount of water that you have to use to create the grain to feed the animals, or that animals are giving off gases that cause a hole in the ozone layer. So this is another line of argument. Please. Sorry? A bit louder. A bit louder?
Just hold it.
Yeah, I'm going to have to hold it into my beard a bit, so it might rustle. Okay. Another claim you may have heard is that vegans are healthier and live longer, or even just vegetarians live longer and are healthier. And I think probably of all of the claims on my list here, the one that seems to me the most obvious, or was the most obvious to me, was that fruit and vegetables are innocent, natural, virtuous, good food choices. And even that I'm going to challenge in what I have to present to you today. Before moving on, I thought I would just again stress some of these things are health related, whereas some of them are simply about moralizing. So I think it's interesting how veganism and vegetarianism is often a kind of nutritional form of liberalism, and liberalism often frames itself in a moral ideology. It will tell you that, it won't argue with you logically, it won't talk to you about science, it will tell you what they believe is right and good, and then this is also why they will often have this very strong reaction against anyone who disagrees with them. It isn't because they think the facts are different and that there should be some kind of a debate, it's just that you're a bad person. So the way that I kind of see this is you can regard veganism or vegetarianism is kind of like the the physiology side of what liberalism is for your psychology. And they're both promoted by the same class of globalists and globalist institutions now. So my question is it possible that based on what we know about these globalist institutions and about the spokespeople for liberalism, that we perhaps ought to take a second thought about what we've been told in regards to these guidelines? And you can probably guess my answer. My answer is certainly yes, we should. And it's a very complicated subject, so I'm really going to struggle to talk about everything I'd like to talk about today. But at the end, I'm going to give you some extra homework or optional homework you can go and do with some good sources of information to make up your own mind. So, from what I've said so far, it may seem that what I'm trying to do is to take aim at vegetarianism and veganism. It isn't really just that. I want to take aim at a greater trend, which is even just the balanced diet idea, the food pyramid that the World Health Organization promote, which is probably very familiar to you, just as it is all across the Western world and probably far beyond. Has anyone not sort of vaguely come across this idea of a food pyramid? Raise your hand if you haven't come across that. Yeah, almost everyone has come across that. It's a very common thing. So, before getting stuck in, I thought it's worth just recapping what we know about our evolutionary biology. People in our kind of groups tend to know about this kind of thing. So we know that evolutionary selection pressures shape an organism over huge periods of time. We also know that for over 2 million years, really up until very, very recently, relatively speaking, we were in an ice age. And that ice age only really came to a close 10 to 15,000 years ago. So in terms of evolutionary time, we really have evolved in an ice age. In this time, ice would have covered huge amounts of the globe, and certainly in the areas that Europeans evolved, which is, I think, most of our ancestors, the ground would have been covered by ice for probably the majority of the year, if not all year round, at certain times during that period. We also know that during that period, our brains increased in size dramatically. We have the largest brain-to-body ratio of any animal. This development probably was driven by selection pressures for survival in this climate, which include the ability to communicate, so things like language. A very large part of the human brain is related to linguistic things about language and understanding each other. Also cooperation, ability to work as a team, to hunt. In this time in the Ice Age, there were a lot of very big animals around, like woolly mammoths and other megafauna, which are no longer around today. Also thinking about the future, planning, general intelligence, the kind of things that we're aware of in relation to, for example, the issues of IQ. In addition to these things that we already know, it's worth noting that because of the ice on the ground, there would have been a very severely limited access to plants of all kinds. Very much the megafauna, these big animals, would use their bodies to move the snow out of the way and to eat the mosses and lichens that grew underneath. Humans weren't capable of doing that, but what we were capable of doing is eating these animals. Also, it's worth noting that animals in colder climates tend to be larger and they tend to carry more fat to keep them warm. And this will be a bit more relevant as my talk goes on. Okay, so the food pyramid and all of the advice that we are given about what to eat and what not to eat is based on scientific studies of all different kinds. Now, there's a kind of a hierarchy of scientific studies, and at the very bottom, in nutrition science, you've got the epidemiological study. This is a study that determines, in some way, what might be the cause of someone's death or illness. And an epidemiological study is often very, very weak. It's not capable of really determining a causation. So, for example, I've got a very interesting graph that shows a perfect correlation between the consumption of margarine in the state of Maine and divorce rates. And I think it should be fairly obvious that people eating margarine in the state of Maine are not becoming divorced because of any relation to what they're consuming. But this is exactly what all of this advice is based upon this kind of a study where they will, for example, say, these people over here, they died of a heart attack. What did they do in their lives? And they will say, okay, they ate this food, they did this amount of exercise, etc., etc. Unfortunately, that just isn't good enough for determining a cause. It is just a correlation. And science is full of very amusing correlations that are completely in no way related to each other, and there is no causation at all. So, whenever you see something in the newspaper, for example, like another one you may have come across is red wine can help protect you from cancer because it has some kind of antioxidant properties. And I think this is more wishful thinking than anything else, because I can tell you that the scientific research that that's based on is when they took a very small element, a very small chemical within red wine, isolated it, created an unnaturally large amount of it, and then gave it to people as a supplement. Drinking red wine, you will never get that amount of that chemical from it. So the newspapers like the story. You know, it's like when the newspapers want to, you know, it's clickbait kind of stuff. They want you to see these interesting headlines and be like, oh wow, I'm going to look at this information and learn something. When actually they've just misinterpreted science, which has been badly done in the first place. So it's a kind of Chinese whispers. So what you really need to determine a causation is a much more complicated and difficult, rigorous kind of scientific study, something like a randomized control group trial where you're controlling for other factors. So to give another example of how this has been, how this could be an issue, is with the issue of saturated fat. Is saturated fat bad for you? Most of the reason that people believe that saturated fat is bad for you is because of an epidemiological study or various epidemiological studies that look at how much saturated fat someone eats and how likely they are to die. Now, the issue with that is there are various confounding issues. So we've been told that saturated fat is bad for us. Therefore, the kind of people who eat a low saturated fat diet are compliant people who want to do the things that they think are best. They're going to be quite conscientious. They found that people who eat saturated fat, more saturated fat, are more likely to smoke cigarettes. They're more likely to drink alcohol to excess. They're less likely to exercise. And all of these other factors that they just do not take account for in these studies. However, they see a correlation, and then they take a causation which is not true, and they have not controlled for these other things. So, are vegans more healthy? Is it a healthy thing to do to adopt a vegetarian or vegan diet? Well, it certainly can be, because the diets that we tend to eat these days are so bad. So if you were to adopt a vegan diet, you'd probably get rid of a lot of junk food that you might be eating. Perhaps you'll stop drinking Coca-Cola. If you're feeling in that kind of a mood, that you want to improve your health, maybe you'll exercise more. So often when someone adopts a vegan or vegetarian diet, they do make some, it has a beneficial effect on them. But it's not because they're eating plants, and it's not because they're not eating meat. It tends to be for other reasons. This is the sort of the conclusion that I've come to from the things that I've read. So certainly a typical vegan or vegetarian diet is better than the Western diet, or what's known as the standard American diet, or SAD. But really that is as far as it goes. An interesting study that took place over 5 years studied some people and measured their brains at the beginning of the trial, then put them on a different diet, some eating meat, some eating a vegan diet. In this study, they showed that the people eating a vegan diet suffered, over 5 years, a 5% brain shrinkage. They did not find the same shrinkage in the people who were eating a diet that included meat. And they also interestingly found that the smallest brain of a person eating a normal diet was larger than that of the largest brain of the vegan in the study. Now that's just one study, it's a small study, so you can't read too much into it, but I'm going to go on to some reasons to do with the types of nutrition you find in, for example, animal fat, that might lead you to think that that's actually quite plausible.
So just to tackle a couple more of these claims about things they tell us are healthy for us. Are vegetable oils more healthy? Well, perhaps olive oil can still be classed as a superfood, but a lot of what is known as vegetable oils are not really from vegetables, they're from grains. So for example, what we have in England is rapeseed oil. In America that's called canola oil. These things are grains, and it takes an awful lot of effort to get oil out of these things. And the type of fat that you get from them is incredibly volatile. It easily goes rancid, and rancid fats are incredibly bad for you. They're carcinogenic and can cause all kinds of immune responses in your body. Also, they're not good for cooking. If you cook with lard, or if you cook with butter, or if you cook with a very stable animal fat, you won't get the changing, the trans fat effects, or the smoking and burning of that fat, which can also lead to some issues. So when you cook, you should cook with a very stable fat. But often people use vegetable fats for cooking, which is really just not a good idea. But the main issue with them is that they are unstable and they go rancid so quickly. Is animal farming immoral? Now, I personally feel that we need to have more strict rules with how people who have animals in their care ought to look after them. I also believe that animals should be in their natural environment. They should be outside, they should be eating grass if they're a cow, they shouldn't be stuck inside in a shed, and I'm entirely against the mass farming methods that have become popular more in America than I think in Europe, but things always seem to be going that way. The other issue to do with, is it better for the planet to not have animal farming? I would say that the main issue there is when you have monocropping, when you have these huge fields of grains, the amount of animals that die is huge, because you have to spray everything with insecticides and pesticides. The combine harvesters have been known to grind up ground nesting birds and small mammals that get in the way. And it just isn't a nice, it isn't a diverse ecosystem anymore. If you've just got a vast field of barley, it's just barley, and it really, really is bad for the environment. So if you truly are an environmentalist, if you are a green, then I think you should support animal farming, because the animals, they eat the grass, they drop their droppings back onto the earth, and it's a whole ecosystem with bacteria and other animals that all feed into a real ecosystem. So are plants good for you? The first thing I think to note here is, when we're talking about plants, we're really talking about quite a broad spectrum of different things. So you've got fruits, and then you've got vegetables of all different kinds. Most tests on the benefits of fruit and vegetables are on fruits and vegetables as a whole. So it's very difficult to isolate, are fruits good for you on the one hand, and are vegetables good for you on the other hand. But I think generally we accept a kind of naturalistic fallacy in this regard, that these plants, they're natural, they're friendly, they don't bite you when you try to eat them. And it's something that I've fallen into myself, and I think this is the thing that's blown my mind the most to learn, that plants, in fact, aren't necessarily good for you. They can, in fact, defend themselves from you. And, of course, arsenic is natural, and no one's going to be eating that anytime soon. Well, they won't tell the tale anyway. So, plants want you to eat certain parts of them. They want you to help spread their seeds around. They want you to eat some of their fruit. The seeds will pass through because they're undigestible, and you will deposit them somewhere far away from that tree with a nice parcel of fertilizer. Now, maybe that's humans that do that, maybe it's animals that are supposed to do that, but certainly that's what humans do. However, there are parts of the plant that they do not want you to eat. They do not want you to eat their body. You know, the plants do not exist so that we can just eat their body. And they will defend themselves against us and against animals. And in fact, most plants are poisonous to us. The number of plants that are not poisonous to us are incredibly small. And the ones that we do tend to eat have been bred by us over many, many thousands of years to be more beneficial to us. And we've bred out some of the negative things, and we've tried to increase the yield and the sweetness and everything. It's taken a lot of effort. But there are chemicals in plants, for example, goitrogens, lectins, and oxalates. And these are the plant's self-defense mechanism. The plant can't run away, it can't fight back when you try to kill it and eat it, but what it can do is chemical warfare, and plants are experts at chemical warfare. These chemicals can play havoc with your gut, they can play havoc with your immune system, and I think there is some research that shows they may be related to allergies and the way that your body responds to unknown external threats. It should also be noted that 99.9% of pesticides are chemicals made in plants to defend themselves. So we are taking the plant's own chemicals to defend themselves, and we are making pesticides out of them. Modern fruits are much larger and sweeter now than they were in the past. And also, the way that we would have eaten plants in the past would be on a seasonal basis. So at a certain time of year you'll have blackberries, another time of year you will have apples. So if you're eating these things, then your body will have time to flush out any toxins that you've taken in. And on that basis you will not build up an overwhelming toxic load from whatever it is you're eating. But if you're eating these things all year round, then you do have an opportunity to build up an unhealthy level of goitrogens or lectins in your body. And there are all different kinds of lectins, for example, and they will hang around in your body for a while. You can flush them out quite easily, but if you're eating them all the time, then your body has this chronic environment with these things around. So we've seen that there is reason to doubt the nutritional advice we're given. And it should be noted that humans are the only animals suffering chronic illness in the world. The only animals that suffer chronic illness, except our pets. And why is that? It's because we feed our cats and dogs corn and wheat and sugar. If you look in dog food, cheap dog food, it's full of carbohydrates and stuff that dogs just are not evolved to eat. So what are we supposed to eat? Let's just take a look at our digestive system and digestive systems in general. The gorilla is a very closely related animal to us, and they eat nothing really but leaves. So let's have a show of hands. Who thinks that gorillas are on a low-fat diet? Raise your hand if you think gorillas are on a low-fat diet. Okay, quite a few people. Quite a few people here are a bit more red-pilled than I thought on this issue. So gorillas eat leaves, but gorillas have a very different digestive system to us. They have a very large cecum, which in a human is a tiny appendix. And this is something that's full of fermentative bacteria. So these leaves that the gorilla eats will be fermented by the bacteria in its gut, and in the end, it produces short-chain fatty acids. So this animal is on a high saturated fat diet. The gorilla gets 70 to 80% of its energy from saturated fat. Now, it's not doing it directly from leaves, but because of the bacteria, that's how it works. A gorilla has what they call a hind gut digestive system. Cows are a bit different. They do exactly the same thing. They also get 70 to 80% of their energy from short-chain fatty acids, saturated fats. However, they are a foregut digester. That is, they have many different stomachs, and the bacteria exist in the stomachs. Also, they will regurgitate what they've eaten and eat it again. So they have a very strange way of doing it. But the important thing to realize is all herbivores are either one or the other, and humans are categorically neither. Our digestive system is much more similar to that of other carnivores, based on hydrochloric acid and relatively short digestive tract, which means we don't have big guts like gorillas and apes do. So what do our ancestors believe? Well, if you've ever seen cave paintings, you'll know that our ancestors hunted big animals, and often these paintings would show very fat, almost comically fat deer or comically fat bison that they would be fantasizing about eating. And by all accounts, there is not a single cave painting of someone picking fruit from a tree or growing a vegetable or eating any kind of plant material at all. In the Icelandic Edda, it said that in Valhalla the feast will be set with clear wine, with fat and with marrow, That's bone marrow, not the vegetable marrow. And bone marrow is a very fatty, highly nutritious part of the body. In the Bible, Cain and Abel made offerings to God, and I think it was Cain who gave an offering of grain, and God was not impressed. Abel made an offering of a fat animal, and God was very happy with Abel. At the return of the prodigal son, the father slew a fatted bull. What did our ancestors actually eat? What do we know about that? Well, by all accounts, coprolites, which are the fossilized remains of human feces, show that from the period of time before agriculture, there is no record at all of any plant material in any coprolites ever found. What they do find is a large amount of organ meats and bone marrow, and a lot of evidence of early humans breaking apart animal bones to get into the fattiest, most nutritious part of the body. And it's also interesting that when you see lions hunt, the first thing they go for is the organs. They go straight into the guts. They want to eat the liver. They want to eat the kidneys. They're not interested in the muscle meat so much.
I thought we were behind schedule. Maybe this lecture could be cut down somewhat.
Yes, we'll do some emeritus. Go ahead.
How long have I been going?
I'm not really sure, but go ahead. We are a bit behind schedule, but...
Yeah, okay. I'll try to cut a few things out, then get to the most important things.
Yes.
Get to the beef.
Yeah, I'll get to the beef, yeah. Okay, so I haven't got that much time then to go into a guy who I really look up to called Weston A. Price. He was an American dentist who went all around the world looking at primitive peoples eating their traditional diets. He found people in all different tropical places. In terms of Europeans, he found two different types. One was a very remote Swiss valley, another was the Scottish Islands. He looked at what they ate, and he looked at how their teeth were, because he's a dentist. He noticed that with the populations that had access to what he called the modern displacing foods of modern commerce, there were lots of dental cavities and health issues. When he went to a place where they were eating the traditional foods, whether it was raw milk or meat, or even some societies where they ate a lot of more carbohydrates and plants, he found healthy people eating these whole foods. Now, the reason that the populations who were eating more carbohydrates and plants had been doing quite well was because they adopted the ancestral processes of how to remove the bad things in these foods and how to increase the nutrition. The way you do that is through things like fermentation. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, they like to ferment cucumbers and to make pickled things, sauerkraut, for example. And this is a fantastic way of making plant foods safe and nutritious for humans to eat. It's almost like doing what cows and gorillas do inside their bodies, outside their body, using bacteria to help us in the process of digesting it. There's always a focus in all ancestral primitive peoples on special sacred foods for young couples, babies and pregnant women, and those things are always animal-based foods. Usually the milk from cows who are fresh to pasture, or things like fermented liver. The human brain is made up of long-chain fatty acids, 90% of the human brain. We can make some long-chain fatty acids out of shorter-chain fatty acids, but we're not very good at it. The only real source of long-chain fatty acids that make up our brain is from animal sources. We adapted in a cold environment because of the challenges we faced, but we could not have adapted and to have the brains that we have today if we did not have the fuel to build them, the building blocks that they are made of. The fats that gorillas and cows get are not the same fats that we get from eating animals. Today, our brains are shrinking and our IQs are declining. It's interesting that most of us are avoiding the kinds of foods that our brains are made of. I think that this issue of nutrition can be a really good red pill that's easier to swallow for many people who are not willing to take the full red pill. Jordan Peterson and his daughter are spearheading a popular movement towards more carnivore diet, and Joe Rogan has had people on there to speak in great detail about this, and I encourage you to listen to those things. I also think that understanding nutrition and the limitations of science can lead to a better understanding of how to determine fact from fiction in a world where people are trying to deceive us all the time, and this even can lead on to things like race realism. Some criticisms and limitations I would make of what I've said, for example, might be people will say, what about vitamin C? How can you get vitamin C if you are on a meat-based diet? You get scurvy or something like that. One of the answer to that from the people who are the experts is that when you are running a fat-based metabolism rather than a carbohydrate, sugar-based metabolism, it's much, much more efficient. You do not produce so many oxidants, therefore you do not need so many antioxidants. Also, vitamin C and glucose are almost chemically identical. So if you're eating a diet high in sugar, then your body isn't going to be able to absorb as much vitamin C anyway. Also, people might say that too much protein can spike your insulin, but that seems only to be true if that person is also eating something else that is causing that issue. It doesn't seem to be a big issue. I'd also warn people about a partial adherence. Go away and do your own research into these things, make up your own mind. But there is a danger that if you, for example, start eating a diet that's rich in red meats and cholesterol, but you also don't stop eating grains and vegetable oils, that you could find yourself in a worse position with your health than you are even now. So you do have to be careful when adopting these things that you're doing it the right way. So, if that's enough, and if you want to catch up with a bit more time, I'll leave it there. I think that's enough to whet your appetites. But what I've got here is I've got a slide which I'll put up now on the screen behind me with some recommended sources for some more reading. I hope you find those things interesting. I recommend every single person on this list very highly. And also, of course, I'll be around to answer questions and take any criticisms of what I've said later. I find that very interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a new perspective, for me at least. Let's just take a short break, 5 minutes to set up the next speaker. So, okay, see you in 5 minutes.
Great. How long was I? Really? Can you get started?
Det er meget interessant. Hvad så bedst på problemer med dollars, når vi giver syge og så videre? Nej, det havde jeg heller ikke.
Ja, tässä on lyhyt 5 minsan tauko. Tässä on ilmeisesti seuraava puhuja Helmuth Nyborg. Tämä oli hauska tämä brittimiehen analyysi, että miksi kannattaa syödä lihaa. Niin se on ja tämä Helmuth Nyborg, mä en ole ihan varma, että mä en pääse infoboksiin katsoa enkä muuta, mutta muistaakseni tämä on jossain yliopistossa kai proffana. Ja en tiedä kyllä puheaihetta. Joo, Aarhusin yliopistosta, niin mä jotenkin muistelinkin. Tää sanoo mulle, että tässä olisi, tätä sanoo mulle, että se käyttää paljon kalvoja ja se aikoo kävellä ees taas tässä. Niin. Mutta ilmeisesti puheet kuitenkin kuuluu hyvin varmaan sinne tietysti mun puhe kuuluu, mutta puhujat. Harmi, kun mulla ei ole jalustaa tälle mikrofonille, se olisi hieno juttu. Joo, tää on psykologian proffa, tää Nyborg. Niin sieltä edellinen puhuja niin sanoi, että varmaan ne, jotka seuraa, niin osaa englantia. Mutta voisi sanoa, että niin, että yleinen mielipide on, että kasvissyönti on terveellistä, niin tämä sitten esitti muutamia näkökulmia, joiden mukaan se ei välttämättä ole niin. Mä en ota itse kantaa tuohon, mutta niin, ihminen tarvii lihaa. Ei kukaan normaali ihminen syö vaan kasviksia.
Kommer ikke med noget, det er sådan noget politisk magtværk, jeg leverer. Så jeg gad ikke gå ud til den her bogpræsentation.
Nej. Det er jo udvalgt som specielt mig, for at diskrediterer hver taler fra.
No, yläpeukuilla totaalinen ilmaherruus varmaankin. En tiedä paljon alapeukkuja. Ne ei edelleenkään näy tässä YouTuben softassa. Sanotaan, että Junekselle en Tuborg grön. Mulla on itse asiassa way ahead of you. Mulla on repussa 4 Tuborgia. Tässä on joku ruokailu kanssa. Ja nyt voisi enemmän kahvia ottaa. Mä käyn katsoa tuolla ulkona äkkiä, että miten tuo homma, saako sieltä kahvia.
Detta ska bara dra igång.
Okay, let's start again. Okay, please have a seat. Running a bit late. Björn, kan du stänga den här dörren? All right. The next speaker has asked me to keep the introduction very short, and that's what I'm going to do, because he has a lot of facts to present to us. He is a retired professor of psychology, and I think you all know him. And after all, we are in Denmark, so we're lucky to have one of Denmark's finest with us. So please welcome Professor Helmuth Nyborg.
For the invitation. Is it working?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
A bit close.
Yeah. Yeah, description. Yeah, okay. I'm going to talk about some data suggesting that our concepts of race can be called into question, and that there might be an alternative that is based on scientific data. I'm taking point of departure in this book, Human Accomplishment, written by the political scientist Charles Murray, and he was mapping the excellence in arts and sciences from 800 years before our count and up to 1950. And he had a remarkable discovery. When he looked in the official and authorized catalogs over progress and found only, or noted only, those persons, significant persons or findings that 50% of the catalogs agreed about were worth sparing some time on, then he found that 97% of these people or these events took place from the tip of Denmark over to Scotland, down England, down to Germany, Austria, and so on. And in the early phase, in the 14th century, Galileo and people from that came here. And up here, these 97% of the significant events were actually done by people coming from that area. They were born in that area, and some of them later immigrated to offshore countries like New Zealand, Australia, and America, North America, but still they had offspring from back to old Europe. And Charles Murray was a cautious man, even if somebody knows he got into trouble. But he said, I can't really explain why, but I can describe that this seems to be the case. I'm going to try to explain why that is so. But first we have to consider that. Why was it only the Europeans? And there are different theoretical positions. The social constructivist, I won't talk much about it, but even very brutal police states cannot make the ideal Soviet scientist person. And the legal one is that if naturalized immigrants will live long enough, second, third generation, they will assume or assimilate the cultures of the countries receiving them. We know that only immigrants from neighboring high IQ countries tend to do so. And even if you take high IQ people from the Northeast Asia, they still form their separate societies, but they are productive and they are not a burden to the country that receives them. We have the strong biological position, everything is in the genes. I don't know any responsible scientist who would say this is the case. The weak biological position is that, well, it's a little bit of nature, it's a little bit of nurture, and it combines, but you cannot really separate them. But we know that intelligence is at least 60% heritable, probably more. And we know that personality is a little bit less heritable, but still enough to say we know the complements given by genetics. And then I'm going to present a new position for you here today, the geobioclimatic position. These differences we see today mirrors what happened during the prehistoric migration, which changed the genetic architecture when people walked over 50,000 years of migration up to the cold north areas. And the point I'm going to drive home at the end of my talk is that we have some recent genome-wide association studies who identifies the architecture of the polygene organizations, and they are beginning to explain population differences, which means that we are now on the track that we can map the polygenic structures that explains why some migrants have difficulties adapting to high northern societies. So the pragmatic or the heuristic thing is to put the evolution of these accomplishments that Murray talked about on an objective formula. And this is intended to illustrate why only people from cold northern countries can make these high-tech societies. And actually, and I won't go very much into it today, but behind all this thinking is an idea that Boltzmann talked about when he read Darwin's Evolution of Species. He said, I think Darwinian selection can be put on a physical formula. And that's an idea that Matka later took up. He was an eminent mathematician, and I have suggested something like that. But as I'm not a physicist, I'm not a mathematician, I have to be a little bit careful when I talk about these areas. So the practical thing I'm going to try to do today is to show you that the sun is shining less in the north than in the equatorial areas, and that is a very important factor in the selection for migrants working out after the African exodus. We have to quantify how much the sun energy loses when we go up north. We have to accept that some human adaptive molecular DNA optimizations were necessary for these people when they came from Africa and had to think about new tasks. They had to think about what are we going to live off when the winter is coming. We have to make new techniques for protecting against the cold. We have to develop some visuospatial skills in order to orient in landscapes that sometimes lose their contour, as in Arctic areas. When it snows and it's bad fog up there, then you really can't see very much. So there was a selection for that. So we have to bring all these ideas on a physical formula to try to understand how the eminence of migrating people was partly due to producing surplus energy. They invented agriculture, they invented industrialization, which was actually the production of surplus energy that could be optimized in the collection, in the uptake, and that allowed for developing high-tech organizations, robots and so on, that could harvest even more energy and then transfer this surplus energy to their offspring. They were also assumed to be optimized physiologically. Here you have a climate card. You have the equator, it's very hot there, it's dry here, it's arid there. Those people who came out from the last 50,000 years migration wave out, they had to pass over here. Some went down there and some went up here. And that was cold selection. They went into colder areas. Some of them went up into the tundra areas or the very cold areas. Then Ice Age came and pushed them back, and sometimes they were allowed to go up again. We have to trace those movements in order to understand what was going on. Here we have equator, and actually it's quite warm. It's about 25 degrees here. As people walk south, it becomes colder, drops to 10 degrees. That's New Zealand. And if you go from Africa and up north, you can see there's a much more spread. Here you have the African countries, here you have countries from the Middle East, and here you have the Scandinavian Nordic countries. If I claim that climate has been an important selective factor, what about going from Greenwich west or from Greenwich east? You can see that the temperature rises significantly, non-significantly here, and the same there. So the argument would be that there will be no selection according to whether people move along the climate belts. But if they go on the other side, there will be selection. Okay, let's see what happens. Here we have a proton-rich area where the main task is to defend the territory, to defend your family, and to know where things are. If you, 50,000 years, have arrived up in these areas, you can see that the photon load is very low, the sun is not shining very much, and you have to go far, and you have to eat meat rather than plants because there are none of you. That will exert different selective pressures on the people. What happened when they went up? Their genetic architecture changed. It's a highly technical area. I'm not a specialist in it, so I won't try even to introduce you to it. But here you have an IQ testing. And then they looked at genome-wide polygenic scores, and they looked for what alleles, what are the basis, the fundamental structure of the DNA molecule, what could give a signal telling you about people's intelligence. And the prediction was very low. They found actually they could explain less than 1% of the variance. Then they increased the sample size to a little under 100,000, and then the precision degree went up to 3%. Then they increased the sample size to a little under 300,000, and it was 4%. This is educational achievement, which is also a proxy of intelligence. And you can see as you go from 300,000 up to 1 million, precision goes up to 10%. The implication of this research is that when you have many millions of genome-wide scannings, then you don't need an IQ test any longer. You can take a spit, you can take a hair, a semen, you can take a skin scrape of the fertilized egg, and then you can begin with high exactitude to predict how people 50 years later will score on an IQ test or how much education they would get. So this is really promising and explosive stuff. And that is my claim, that this genetic architecture changed while we walked out from Africa and up north, and that explains population differences in important areas. I have said already that race is something of a suspicious thing, because if I say I'm black, but I'm Afro-American, then we know that I, on average, have 20% white genes in my genome. Am I so 20% white and 80% black? It makes little sense. When I talk as a Dane, I have a gene scanning and so on, I know that I have some genes from Africa. Actually, most of them are there from. But there are some fraction that are not. And that is what makes the difference between people from Africa staying in Africa and people living up here in the north. So I thought, if now we take the average distance people live from the equator, We take the temperature they are living under there. They might live in mountainous areas or in valleys, and that might make a difference. And then look at the average skin color of the people living there as an indication of where your forefathers spent a considerable amount of time doing their prehistoric work. The further north, the whiter the skin. When I made a little mathematical maneuver called principal component analysis, I found that distance, color, and temperature loads fairly high on this concept and explains 91% of the variance. What if we use this as an indicator instead of race for people looked at from their evolutionary past? Look at what comes out of it. Here we have the equator, and here the countries are distributing themselves around this new parameter, and you can see you have the Nordic countries, European countries here, you have the Middle East here, and you have the African countries here. So it apparently makes sense in geological sense. Yeah. Now, if you look at the distance from Kenya and you look at the haplogroups, you can see that here we have, in the very hot area, a very low genetic distance from Kenya, which we should expect. It increases up here. That just confirms that there are genetic differences between the migrants, and it relates to how far they went up north. Here we have those people living in very warm areas, a warm eco-niche, and they have an average temperature above 24 degrees. They have a distance that is fairly close to equator, and they have fairly dark skin. If you go to the coldest country, you can see the temperature drops from the average rather steeply down here, down to a little less than 4 degrees here. They are far away from equator, and somebody could see that they have light skin. You have to trust me on that. Did this eco-niche select for different body types, ecotypes? You can see that very hot people are light. The further you go north, the heavier they are. And you remember the speaker before me said that animals up in the north are heavier than the south. That applies to humans as well. The body mass index increases from 21 to 25. Ruston and Ruston did a study of brain sizes in 2003, and they looked at autopsy data, endocranial volumes, and external head measures converted into cubic centimeter. They summarized that and found that Africans have an average brain size of 1260, and Northeast Asians about 100 cubic centimeter larger, with Europeans in the middle. Could explain that. They moved somewhere, they made the furthest north. Now Beale, Smith and Dodge have digged up old brains. They are between 10,000 years and 1.2 million years old. And if we look at the ecotype, approximately the very hot one, they found that the average brain size is almost 1,300, almost 1,400, again a 100 cubic centimeter difference, again with the Europeans people in the mean. So it appears that something happened that could explain by temperature differences. And that is what I think the surprising thing. Temperature makes people different. You think it's a new concept? The old Greek actually said that. Now we have IQ in the very hot eco-niches. And the hot ecotypes have an IQ of 65 on average. It goes up almost linearly. It drops a little when you come up in the very high north. I have an explanation for that if you're interested. We can discuss that later. Educational scores. If you take the PISA scores, do you believe they would reflect this ancient migration? It does. There are no PISA for the very hot areas. But as you go here from eco-niche 3, 84 up to 98, TIMSS is a mathematical international score, same structure. It rises from 83, 84 up to 96. And this is a reading test. Look across 99, 96, 98, 97, and now comes the interesting thing, 97.97. That's the best cross-national IQ scores we have, corrected for all sorts of shortcomings and so on. So educability and intelligence seems to evolve according to the same line. Now, if we have a number of measures of personal freedom, basic human needs, tolerance, inclusion, and so on, I did a little mathematics on that, a principal component analysis. All these concepts are loading fairly high on the PC1, and I called it altruistic sociability. Could it be that those who walked up north had more need for cooperating, for sharing their food, because there was so little, and if they didn't learn to share, they simply disappeared from the evolutionary scene. Here we have the absolute latitude. You can see the altruism component is low in the African areas, becomes a little higher in the Middle Eastern areas, and become higher up here, until perhaps altruism turns into its pathological form. We become too concerned with saving the world, and perhaps that's not to our own good. Okay, so the altruism is actually different from the very hot ecotypes with -1 standard deviation going up to 1 standard deviation, which means it spans 2 standard deviations, which means and tells us that altruism is significantly different and goes from equator and up at an almost linear fashion. These people living in very hot areas, they expect to have about 10 years of schooling before they went into the tertiary educational system. The others down here have almost the expectation of being in school for the double of the time. The very hot ecotypes, they have a mean per capita income of 1,700, increasing to 17,000, a tenfold increase, and you can see it's steep, it becomes steeper up here. The Human Development Index is an official measure of how nice it is to live in a country, and it goes up. The index for the quality of the democracy at the place and of the market economy, if it's brutal or corrupted or not, it also increases. And economical freedom, which is an individual score, also increases. So, what I've been saying is that 5,000 years of migration into still colder areas where the sun is not shining as much accelerated brain size, IQ, and altruism. And Richard Lynn is the main man describing this process. This evolutionary optimization changed the genetic structure and explains why only the cold ecotypes can develop high-tech societies. And I think that is one of probably many explanations why Murray could find his high-tech societies in the northern, in the European countries. So I think that the race concept should be replaced with ecotyping, which is defined physically. And I think the conclusion of the globalization and open border politics and naturalization of people from all over the world brings ecotype together that are genetically and phenotypically different, and that will rise ethnic tensions. This was the first part. How am I doing on time? Okay. Now I'm going to talk about the decay of this evolutionary event we call the Western society, or we call civilization. Murray mapped the scientific inventory and found from 1400 and up, it increased But around 1850, something happened. All his curves goes down. I have done some studies together with some other people indicating that intelligence has also begun to decline from about that time. But I won't go into that today. So I wrote a paper called The Decay of Western Civilization, and I had very much fun, and I had to go through court cases and so on. And actually, Elsevier Science, they said, we will not retract this paper because we have put up an international committee of some of the best heads in the world in that area, and they say there's no cheating here. So I sued the Danish state, and I won 200,000 Danish kroner, and they went directly into my solicitor's pocket, but he did a very nice job, so I think that was just fine. So I think we have two major problems here. One is within the system. We have low fertility in Europe. We have a mutational load that is increasing because we are able now, by medical advances, to save more people that even can reproduce, and that will in the long run ruin the genetic quality of any population, including those high-tech countries where it will be worse because we are the best to save people. And dropping IQ, I've already talked about that here. And then we have the extra-systemic, and that's a significant immigration from countries with high fertility, and unfortunately also with high consanguinity rates. I'll talk about that in a minute. And we also have other southern, non-Western, low IQ immigrants. That threatens the whole system. I tried to make some statistics about it. This is a logarithmic scale, and this is 1% of the population. And you will see people, immigrants from the other Nordic countries, and from South and Middle America, and from European offshoots, that's American, Canadians, and so on, and from Northeast Asian, because of their low fertility, will remain less than 1% of the population. Ethnic Danes are declining, and we don't even know if this curve is correct, because the Danish authorities, as the British and German authorities, say, hey, we have some naturalized people from Afghanistan, two Afghanistans who get a Danish citizenship, and all their children are Danes, which means that they count up in the Danish fertility rates and count down in the immigrant fertility rates. And I have protested, and the response of the statistical department was I was manipulating the data. Okay, so those groups who are actually taking over the country are from the Indian subcontinent, from the Middle East, and North and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I have to say that these predictions out to 2075 are based on the fertilities in the countries of origin. And I might have overdone that because fertility usually declines when people come into their new country. But some English studies actually show that some immigrants who actually have more children in Britain than they had in their country of origin. Here we have the net migration rate. The very hot people have minus 1.15, which means more people leave than are coming to their countries. That applies to all the warm eco-niches, and the receiving countries are up here, and this is Europe, which are taking a heavy load of migration. The urban population is very low density in the warm areas. They live in country areas, and they move into urbanized areas, so they have to adjust to a completely different lifestyle. The median age in the very hot areas are 18 degrees, increasing up here, and we are an aging population, you can see. The mother's mean age as the first child is almost 20 years here. We get children very much later. And the annual population growth is 0.031, and it's actually negative down here, slightly negative. Now comes the real horror thing. Here we have the warm and the very warm ecotypes. They reproduce above average, which means they become more and more. They take over the evolutionary scene. Here we have the reproductive losers in cold and very cold areas, And that applies whether we look at the national fertility rate, crude birth rate, or birth rate in general. We are simply evolutionary losers, ladies and gentlemen, it's you. Now, these are the areas with inbreeding depression, because the cousin marriages are very often in here. Those are the people who are wandering up here to this tiny area, down to Italy and up to Europe in general. And also, the percentage of Muslim population is very high in these areas, up to 80 to 90% in many areas. Does it mean a thing? Well, if you talk to Muslim immigrants and ask them, would you like Sharia to become the official law in the country where you are going to now? These are the percentage of people who say, yes, we want Sharia there. Of course, it's an average. It's made by a Pew Research Center, which is a fairly respectable organization. But the point is clear. They want a system that is very different from what we have. And add to that, that the average IQ is considerably lower. But still remember, it's a normal distribution. Even in the darkest area of Africa, there are splendidly gifted people. They are just fewer, because any population have a normal distribution around the averages I have presented to you here. Should always keep that in mind. And when you say, oh, but I know an immigrant that is doing fine, yes, there should be, and you can calculate how many of them there should be there. The ethnic heterogeneity is high in the warm areas, dropping down here. And interestingly, ethnic conflict rate is also dropping as you go up north. Now, these groups are coming down here, and everybody can think about that. The fractionalization index is high here, dropping. Cultural diversity index dropping. Linguistic fractionalization dropping. So, I think there are consequences. Short-term individual. Some people up here might feel more worried. There will be demographic changes. There will be religious changes. In long term, there will be societal changes and political and also infiltration. So that will change the democracy, enlightenment, and civilization. I wrote in 2012 that we have 3 responses. Submission. We can just sit down and say, okay, that's what's happened when people move. We can close our border and pay an honorable repatriation, or we might take the risk of a civil war. Why are so few Europeans and Americans not seeing that danger? I think the greatest collective academic fraud in the 20th century is the progressive left-wing social constructionism. Left-leaning universities who systematically misinforms the politicians about educational, occupational, and immigration policies. The following IQ, the genetic deterioration, and ignoring that demography is destiny. And another factor is that nationally, governments are confused. Many of them knows about this, but they don't dare say it because it's policy and they know they will lose. And the Swede Democrats knows that perfectly well. Granting committees will not give money to the research I just had. Feel-gooders think that we are bad people. United Nations, EU, and NGOs are also responsible for this. And the missing family policy for the fertile, low IQ countries is a catastrophe for them as it is for us. So I think this eco-nation way of looking at it makes the discussion of several things like national borders, culture, and race concept questionable, because national borders are often the function of some war, peace treaties that divided and combined people of different ecotypes. That doesn't do well. Culture is too difficult to define, and race varies in number. So I think this geo-bioclimatic adaptation to slow northbound migration will show that they differ in their genetic architecture, in particular with respect to what drives brain development, IQ, and altruism. So these subjective reported race categorization should be replaced by objective, physically defined ecotype categorizations. So I think that when assimilation goes wrong in the northern country, it's because we are introducing molecularly different ecotypes and forcing them to live together, and that will fail with guarantee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to have Professor Nyborg on board with the show. Can you show me a show of hands of how many of you are at an event of this kind for the first time? That's a majority. That's very good. That's very good. Thank you. I think probably we need to get something to eat because people are getting a bit hungry. So I think we'll just reshuffle the schedule a bit. We'll take the next speakers after the lunch break. So let's take a lunch for about an hour and a half. It gives you time to get something to eat and perhaps something to drink. Then we'll meet back here at 4:30. Okay, thank you.
Question. The restaurant out here is ready to receive us, or do we go out in town?
Niin tässä on nyt
You have to find
puolentoista tunnin tauko.
You have to find somewhere to eat, yes.
Eli 4:30 jatkuu Suomen aikaa 5:30. Tää oli tosi kova tää proffa. Tää tykitteli siitä, että kuinka lämpötila vaikuttaa osaamiseen. Voisi ehkä kysästä siltä yhden jutun. Niin sillä oli kalvot loppu tohon, että thank you for not...
Is this the only film? Is that film?
This is the only live stream, but I think they are recording.
Okay, I'm just a bit paranoid about being caught on film.
Yeah, well, as long as you don't walk past, you will not be seen. Okei, tosiaan, niin tuossa kalvoilla on, että kiitos kun ette skriimaa. Mutta meillä on erityislupa tähän skriimaukseen. Niin kysyttiin, että onko Ramsey Paul täällä. Hän ei ole täällä tänään. Joo, mä juttelin tuon Nyborgin kanssa aikaisemmin täällä, mutta niin, tää sali tyhjenee, niin jossain vaiheessa voisi kääntää kameraa, kunhan kaikki lähtee. Tuossa oli, että niin lämpimien maiden ihmiset, niin niillä on aika paljon yhteistä. Ja se sanoi, että yksi mielenkiintoisin havainto tällä tyypillä oli, että käytännössä sä voit ottaa ihmiseltä DNA-testin ja sen perusteella arvioida, mikä sen älykkyysosamäärä on. Siirrän tätä vähän tuonne. Ja mun mielestä se taisi sanoa jotain, että se on itse joskus ottanut DNA-testin, niin tämä oli just se kysymys, jonka voisi esittää, että suositteleeko se jotain yritystä vai onko se niin kuin itse tehnyt tämän niin kuin jossain yliopistossa. Ja tässä on 1,5 tunnin tauko. Mä katsoin, että näkyykö tässä... Tässä on enää 25% akkua, niin voi olla, että mä katkaisen tämän heti, kun mä oon päässyt tuolta kysymään jutun, ja sitten mä laitetaan toinen. Tässä on enää 25% akkua tässä puhelimessa jostain syystä, niin mä annan sen vähän latautua, ja sitten 5:30 tää jatkuu. Meillä on tässä 1,5 tunnin ruokatauko. Niin, ihan sali on nyt lähes tyhjä. Takana on yksi ihminen. Kohta voin kääntää kameran. Pikainen. Tämmönen sali. Tää oli ihan täynnä. Niin. Mutta kun nuo muut ihmiset tuossa kyselee, niin mä pääsen kysyä jossain muussakin vaiheessa, mutta jos mä lopetan tän, niin jatketaan tuossa 5:30 Suomen aikaa. Yes, so we have a 1.5 hour break, and since my phone has a low battery, I will use this to charge it. So we continue at 4:30, I think, Central European time.
That's a depressing finding, because I'm a teacher.
Yes.
So
we have about 80 minutes break, and we'll continue on this same channel.
Yeah.
Is there an effect or something other than IQ?
An effect of what?
Of what the teacher does?
Is Millennial Woes in the chat?
There's a new study just coming out showing that teacher variability explains less than 2% of the variability, total variability of schools. And Linda Gottfriedson said many years ago, smart schools are schools where smart pupils are, not where smart teachers are.
I see that he was there, but I didn't catch what he said. Yeah, I think Millennial Woes has been at a previous Scandza Forum in Oslo, I think. But yeah, I'll end this here, and we'll continue in about 80 minutes on this channel. Thanks for watching.